So let's welcome everyone to the session. Thank you very much. Great. Let's get started with welcoming our speakers. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Henderson. Pronouns are he, him. I work at a accessibility agency called Mantis & Co. as their head of design technology and systems. So we have accessibility and design systems. That's my thing. Good to be here.
A great expert on accessibility, so I'm really excited to have him on this call. Taylor, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. I'm Taylor Kashdan, he, him pronouns. I'm based in the US on the East Coast, and I currently work at Mayo Clinic. I'm the Science Systems Manager.
Love it. Raquel?
Hi everyone, so I'm Raquel. I've been working with design systems for a while. At the moment, I'm a UX lead designer at Nokia for Nokia Design System. And as a part-time job, because I like to talk, I also do some events and workshops on Friends of Figma Portugal. So maybe I can drop the link so you can figure it out and try to understand where Portugal is. And that's pretty it from my side.
Raquel, please share your link. Your
Yes,
community is
yes.
one of the strongest communities right now in Friends of Figma, I guess. So,
Yes. Yeah, we got excited. So yeah, gonna
yeah.
promote a bit. Yeah.
You have in-person events as well. Like I feel like that's like
Yes.
10 times much more harder.
Yes. We try to balance with hybrid and online and just in person. So yeah, it's been fun.
Love it. Great. So the goal of our session today is to go through the IBM design system and see exactly how their design system components are being actually used within the product to perform the design system inventory. But instead of doing that during the call, we'll just go through some of our findings and discuss what kind of action steps we would like to take if we see some specific challenges with specific component families, for example. The way you can also help us during our session. For some components, we couldn't find much components being used within the product itself, or you have access to their internal products. Please take screenshots, please add more examples so we could dive deeper. The way how you can do that, you can just open ibm.com website. You can take screenshots and capture the code yourself, or you can use Infa. You can activate the Chrome extension. There is a board called IBM Carbon Design System within the community. You can open it, import all the components that we already tagged, and see all of it directly on the IBM.com website by clicking on this discovery mode. By clicking on the discovery mode, you can highlight what kind of components we've tagged before. And by clicking on them, you can actually open the information about specific component, read more details, capture the code right here, and do some more tagging if you want. So by clicking on this select element button, you can actually select more components and tag it directly in the browser. And then by using the PGM plugin, you can actually import it the same way how we will going to share it right now in a second. So we would like to start with the first component called tiles. Let me just quickly add it right here. I will move everything down. We'll put the tiles right into our canvas. Great. So as you can see here, we already did the tagging. So on the left side, you will see the design system documentation. And on the right side, you will actually be able to see the components that we were able to find. And there are some interesting findings. So let's dive deeper into the tile design system documentation. The tiles are highly flexible component for displaying a wide variety of content, including information, getting started, how-tos, next steps, and more. So here is the way how it could be utilized, how it could be shown within the product. What kind of variants do they have? So instead of just being as a card, they have this like different states of tiles where you can single select tile or have a clickable tile, expandable tile, and others. And also here are the different variations that they have within their documentation website where they're explaining how your tiles could be expanded and utilized within your product. And also they have some interesting things around AI. You found some interesting learnings from here, from the documentation, that cards and tiles are actually different things. Would you like to start and share your learnings? about the tiles and
Yeah.
cards?
Thank you for it. So what I found out actually, it's inside of the Carbon design system, there's like this ecosystem, and inside of that, they have like a design system just dedicated to the website. But basically, for what I conclude, they just use the components from the Carbon design system, and they put like a new purpose on it, or just combine more stuff. And I think this one is interesting to understand better, because on the Carbon design system, they have tiles and they have quite of an explanation. And I think it's a new thing from the latest version. And then on the design system for IBM.com, they still have the cards. As a user, because I'm not at IBM every day, it's a little bit challenging for me to understand the difference between them. But for them, it seems really obvious, and they put a lot of motives, like when to use the title and when to use the card. For what I understood, I think the tile is for more action stuff, and the card is for more media and content approach. So you can see there the approach with the cards, even though that visually they look the same, and they even have the same grid and spacing rules, they call it differently. And I found that it was interesting that even though they look the same, they have different rules. So probably that's why they chose a different name, perhaps. But yeah, it was interesting on that.
Love it. But the main question is like within their main design system documentation, right? CarbondesignSystem.com. They don't have cards as a section, right? Why do you think is
So they
that?
have
Like
like
they
they have like a card group inside of the cards, where you basically have also the personalization on how to use the multiple cards. I'm not sure if that was your question, in case, because on tiles you have a lot of patterns on how to combine those.
Yeah, like my question was that within the carbondesignSystem.com components, they don't have cards section, right?
Oh yeah,
They have
sorry, my
only
bad. Yes, they don't have. Yeah. Maybe Teller wanted to join for the conversation,
yeah.
so go for it.
Those interesting, use cases where like we're seeing the version of the system that is publicly available versus what they may be using internally, right? So I think this is just one of those pitfalls of the way our space is growing, right? Is that there's a lot of publicly accessible design systems and open source systems. That doesn't always mean that that exact same site, that exact same set of guidelines, whatever, is stuff that's used internally. Because we know companies as large as like IBM, right? They have multiple product lines, multiple visual identities, and we're only seeing, one of the many, 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 many things. So I think it's just an interesting thing to call out, because this discrepancy that you're talking about, like the difference between naming and that sort of thing, is a very common challenge that teams need to solve. But
Yeah,
in addition, I think it's an interesting thing when it comes to like all of us practitioners trying to learn from each other when we identify things like this, right?
yeah,
And the first guttural reaction is like, oh, there's a problem with the system. And it's like, well, no, this is just that their marketing tool, the public version
right.
of the site, right, only has one
Yeah,
set of things, when there may or may not be a focus on the internal tool, which has things that are behind a
yeah,
login
yeah,
gate or whatever. So it's always interesting when we see the difference between
yeah,
those ecosystem. That's why this activity is such an interesting one, because we'll be able to
yeah.
see some things and there'll be a lot we probably can't see. So it's cool.
Yeah. Regarding naming, I also have another theory that I also often see, is that people are used to that name. So it has a lot of history behind that name. Tricky. So when they probably have the chance to, because it was a public one, like, okay, here we're going to call tile because we can do it like that. But internally, because everyone just associate card as card, this is just a guess, but using an example, probably is challenging for them to use the same name. So I think sometimes the attachment of the name could also make these happening more, like different names, even though it's the same thing. And it's an interesting
Totally.
one. Like, should the name correspond to the component, or should be comfortable with people because people know it? I think it could be a balance, but yeah, sometimes it's tricky what
Yeah. Well,
happens.
and you're right, because it also comes like tile and card. If you boil them down, they're both containers, right? So like,
Yeah,
which one's right? And the answer is both. Depends on
yeah,
how you're
yeah,
defining the tile versus defining the card, like, and all those things. And I'm sure, Daniel, I'd love to hear your take on like the accessibility side of that, right? On like objects that are interactable versus display only, and kind of that relationship between the name associated with the way tools read them, that sort of stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And then the way I've always seen it myself is like tile is this kind of like baseline component where it contains anything. It's just our border and our background. And card is a implementation of tile. It consumes tile and does other things. It's a more specific component than just a bog standard box. That's my interpretation of it and how I've done it at other organizations. But I think to your point, Ted, it's really important that even for basic components like card that we hit, that almost every design system has, there's a clear definition of a view of what a card is for us. Because it's going to change slightly whether you have these huge, IBM has these huge interactive areas with links. You don't see that often in most sites, and so they may have a slightly different definition to what a card or tile is because of their kind of user interface design and branding that they have.
That brings up a really good flavor, Daniel. Oh, sorry, Raquel, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I was just saying that specifically those two, it's really like a visual identity point to IBM. So that's why it's has a lot of information and a lot of documentation. And they're both very complex because if you see on the Carbon and on the website, it's really part of that visual identity. Like it's a language that they use often. So it's quite interesting. So maybe that the naming was also related to that for the way that it's part of the visual identity, I think. Yeah. Sorry, go for it, Taylor.
Yeah, I think no, I think you're right, Raquel, and I think it's a good segue into what I was going to say, and that like everything you brought up and Daniel's point as well, just is a good reminder for all of us, right? Of like, hey, when you're looking at a tile or a card or something that's commonly named, don't assume you know what this version of it is meant to do, right? Take the time to read the description, check a skim of the usage guides, because you may be looking for examples of what your organization calls a modal, right? But some other organization calls a pop-up, I don't know. And that way you can like really reconcile, like getting rid of the top level thing of like the name, because really that doesn't matter, right? You can call it whatever you want, but what it is, right? So that we don't look and go, oh, tile's a tile, because it's obviously not, right? We have this one very, very distinct use case here where we can see it's not the same. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
But should we make everything unified?
Yeah, that's a cliche question. But it's a very challenging
I think it's one of those. Yeah, it's challenging, but it's also one of those things where it's like, what's the benefit, right? Does that actually help us or does that hurt us, right? Because you have different cultural, and societal and social understandings of what one thing means to another, right? I don't think we're able to get to like worldwide unified name of what is a card, right? I just don't think it's possible, especially because you talk about translation, right? Language differences. Maybe the word card means something different in another language.
Right. I think one of the benefits that I see on top maybe could be related to accessibility, like how things are translated on code with the area labels. I see some advantage on that, but in case it's not depending on that, I think it should be adjusted to the culture of the knowledge inside of the company. So people at IBM, they know tile is, that's the thing, is like our special card and for instance.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Raquel. Like the name doesn't matter so long as you do the job of explaining the thing, right? You can call it, and I think there's many. I think there's an article out there about one of Dan Mull's systems where they called a component Fred, right, or something like that. Like it's just one of the common stories. Like the name doesn't matter as long as people understand what it is and how to use it. So to your point, I think that's exactly it. But I think the interesting thing is like we talk a little bit about like unifying names at the discipline level. That's probably not possible. But unifying names internally, very different thing and very worthwhile in my opinion.
At a global level, one thing that is easy to forget is that we do have some form of global naming, which is the HTML living document. Like inputs are inputs in HTML. The developer codes in. That's what most of us call them. You may call them text fields. There's a few synonyms, but input is usually the name people use. And so there are a few. Card isn't one of those elements that exist. And then maybe one day, if we do end up with a HTML element related to card, then we can start to define those things. But one thing that related to that I've always encouraged in my teams is, if there is a name in the HTML living spec, we should use that name as our assistant name. If input exists, we should make sure that our input thing is definitely called input, because that's what developers are looking for and they're used to seeing. Let's not try and change the spec that has been around for 20, 30 years. Right? And if there is something that's already in the spec, we shouldn't have a name for that component that means something else. And what I mean by that is actually there's a role called banner in
Right.
ARIA. It's very common to see a component that's this huge thing along the screen. It's like alerting you about certain things, and we call that banner or banner in the right
Yes,
panel.
yes.
But it's actually the run. If you actually look at the use case for role banner, it's actually not used
Yeah.
for that. And so you're having up with these kind of different, with having our own definition of the spec, where it could cause confusion. And just make sure
Yeah.
you're always aligned with what the spec is already saying, and then extend it yourself. Make sure there's no contradictions.
Yeah.
Love it.
That's a
And
very
thank you,
good point.
community, for adding the links here directly into FigJam. So love it. Thank you very much. So we can dive deeper into actual components, right? So we've tagged a couple of them. And as you can see here, there are so many different types of components, and maybe some of them are mixed up with the tiles and cards from another design system, right? The internal or product design system that they have. So the first one is the large clickable tile. You can hover over on this like second link to see where exactly it's being tagged, right? So it's IBM.com website. And here, as you can see, looks like there are some things that are similar, right? Like subtitle
Mm-hmm.
and title. In some cases, maybe the size is different, but the spacings are looking the same. The action button is always on this place, but looks like for the smaller cards, it's aligned to the bottom. There are other things, and let's maybe better to IBM tiles first and break them with others. So this is another, it might be a tile or a card, not sure. Let me just move things around, and I will pull every card that we found within the IBM.com website. And I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, do you feel like it's the same component? Do you feel like that's someone added components where they might look the same, but actually from the code perspective, it's completely different thing? Let's dive deeper into that right now. 1 second. Let me just prepare everything here. So as we can see here, this is the might be cards of the element name, right?
Yeah.
But
Seems like
for
it.
documentation, difference. I don't see anything that like similar to each other. For featured product tiles, it's another thing, right? So who wants to go first? This is like very interesting thing. Like, and this is the goal of the session, right? To show that, okay, like we found the components that are being used within the product, within our
Right.
products. So what is the next steps? Like, Raquel, from your perspective, what would you do first when you see all these different variations of tile components?
Yeah. First, I would try to validate the reason why is different. So for instance, at glance, I noticed that these two are, the whole card is clickable. So maybe technically they had the different need of building it. So it could be the whole component clickable. So that's why they probably consider to do it in a different way. And so I would basically try to understand with the devs, like what would be the approach on when building that. And what I suspect is probably because one of them was all clickable and the other was not. And that's basically my first guess so far. Yeah.
Taylor, do you have any thoughts here?
I'm skimming the code snippet just to see if there's any learnings or gleanings you can pull from there. I think the interesting thing in these, just the two, like the large clickable tile and the IBM recommended tile for you is, right, like what is the use case, right? What's the end result? Because I think that where this starts to the whole card discussion starts to ask the question of like, what is your org or what does IBM Carbon's team consider, an adopter, right? Adoption. Because if their mindset is like, as long as you're using like their tokens, right, which you can argue probably at least from font files and maybe color, all of these are somewhat aligned, right? That could be considered like they're all using the system and then are solving for their particular product needs on the outset, clickable tile, link here, or whatever. But what's interesting too is like the other, like the IBM Watson X.AI one, like that is obviously colored differently in the background, right? So we start to think about, all right, is that an override? Is that a separate version? Is that, is that its own tile? Is that even a tile in the first place? Is it just a div,
Right.
that's got a background? We don't know. So that's interesting because again, back to Raquel and Daniel's earlier point, like defining what purpose the tile serves in the ecosystem of the system and therefore in the product would, I would hope, help teams know, like, so is this the tile or is this a thing that looks like a tile and it's okay that it's different? Is it using similar things from the tile? And I, that's all stuff we would never be able to see, but very interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is a great example of showing why design systems are important in a way to make sure that we have that consistency, especially when it comes to the accessibility side. Like there's a bunch of other factors of why it isn't consistent, Taylor, to your point. But there are some like glaring issues actually with some of these components because we've had standardization in here. The section 1 IBM featured posts, they have come to me for it. There we go. I'm over here. Section 1. There we go.
Oh.
You can spotlight yourself so we could follow you.
Oh, that's right. I meant to do that bit on. Sorry, my bad. Sorry, I told you I'm not used to German very much. Okay, here we go. Got it. This is our card component, and you'll notice they look the same, other than the background color, right? They're essentially the same component, but the kind of the root component, the root element for this component is a tag, so it's a link. Well, the first one, one is a div.
Yeah.
And so you already have this weird thing of, okay, the element itself is a completely different thing. And so, like, one thing that's always important to remember is that it's not always about what it looks like, it's about what it is. You should always be thinking about what this thing is. Right? So, what we're saying here is this entire card is a link, which is cool, I think. I'm saying I think because I'm not someone using a screen reader and they may have a different opinion to them. But if that's why it's really important to make sure you always test these things. I don't quite know here what's best. But what's interesting is they have put an area label on this card. And so what that's basically doing is it's overriding the computed value for this link. So the computed value being whatever's inside the link will get read out to a screen reader, or is what you say if is a voice control user. The ARIA label just overrides that and says, no, this is what I want it to be. And so you're saying that the ARIA label is ARIA Watson AI, which is probably right. That's probably what you want as a voice control user. You probably want to say tap IBM Watson X, right, to activate this link. But the problem being is if you're a screen reader user, the description of this component is now lost. So a next generation enterprise studio for AI, right? If you're using a screen reader and you tab onto this, you're not going to hear what IBM Watson X is. You're just going to hear there's a link to it, and you've lost that description. And so that's where you've seen a whole of maybe if you'd used the components and full of documentation, that may have not happened, because I'm sure the Carbon team would have thought about that already.
Well, Daniel, I'm wondering, so I'm tracking with everything you're saying. What I'm curious about is using Infa, right, to scrape this little code snippet. And that, is there anything that these tools, being that we're on the front of the front end, right, for lack of a better word, would skip in terms of what it would pull? Like maybe, and my question, right, is that like maybe if both of these are started, from the root on the tile component, maybe there's some stuff behind the scenes that we're not seeing that would enable some of that tooling? Or is your stance that we would see it here, and therefore these are obvious, like the one on the right, not as accessible as one on the left, right? And the one on the left, even missing some important things like calling out the subhead and all that other stuff.
Yeah. The one on the right, I don't think I can make an assessment whether or not it is, because there's no A tag in this segment of code. And I'm pretty sure that if A tag in this, if we want this to actually be a real link. So it's probably just missing. So
right. And there's a wrapper, right? Yeah. So there could be things inside the wrapper that we don't see.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the big distinction is because it's not a real element on the web, right? It's something that we've all made up and we've reused it over and over again. And while we have this conversation of what should it be called, there's also a conversation of how should we code it. There's an equal conversation. You could wrap the entire thing in an A tag. You could wrap it in a div and have a single element that's focusable and interactive inside of it. So that's just as complicated, if not more complicated, than what it is and what's the name. And so that's where your design system really has to have this consistency across the board about what it is, what it's called, what it looks like. And only then you get a result that's useful for everyone.
Designers at the audience to learn more about the HTML basics, because sometimes I cross with designers that don't have a clue about the essentials of the HTML, and sometimes when they're doing the handoff, they're just still like, look, this is a card. and it's clickable. And maybe if they already knew some HTML basics, they could do those annotations note regarding accessibility. Like this would be a link. This would have this inside. So I think I'm still missing in the community some resistance to learn, even though that's super old and super basic. But I think it's really important more and more, especially on this accessibility stuff, to classify, to know which thing it's what, and to which one you will have the description on. Because in case the designer does not provide the descriptions, for instance, the developer will not know, right? So I think it could be interesting for the overall community to learn more on that topic, because in my experience, I see still missing that on the design part. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't want to dive too deep into the designer should code discussion, but I don't.
Yeah.
You don't need to code to be a designer. I think that's very important. There's great designers out there who don't know how to code. But I also find that designers who have a basic knowledge of code doesn't mean they're better, but they understand their platform better. And that's a really important thing as a designer, is understanding what your platform can do and how it works, because then you can make the most of it within your designs. And so I think the basic understanding of how buttons work, how links work, how headings work, gives you another level of understanding of how you can build a design that's useful for everybody. So we can leave it there.
Taylor, you have a thought?
Yeah, I wanna add something to what Daniel said too. I think that the crux of what you're saying, in the sense of like the code, no code, all that stuff, comes down to talking to people, right? Like designers don't need to code, but they do need to be able to talk to engineers, right? And vice versa. Engineers should also be able to talk to designers. Like it's a two-way street, right? And by learning some of those basics, that sometimes helps. But at a minimum, just going into those conversations, like going, I don't know what I don't know, I want to know, like to ask. And on the other side of that, in terms of like the conversation more specifically today, right? Tile versus card, container versus not container, whatever. I think a lot of teams tend to want to be like, all right, cool, design system has to go and define this. We need a stance. We need an opinion. We need to tell people what to do. And that's one way, right? The other way is go out and talk to your community. Talk to the people using the tile and using the card, and see why that term or that name or that function or that feature resonates with them before you make a change or a sweeping decision, right? Because at the end of the day, this is I think that the job of a design system is not to come in and police things. It's not to come in and tell people they're doing things wrong or tell things they're doing things right. It's to be an aggregator and a collector of standardization, right? So if that means your entire org likes the word tile and your team likes the word card, guess which thing you should use, right? Like that's where, and there's obviously, that's very simplified, but like, I think that comes into all of this stuff in terms of like, is the wrapper handling accessibility? I don't know. We need to talk to somebody, right? Like, is tile being, an attribute that the screen readers are looking for some reason, right? Go figure that out. Do they better interact with things that are called card because of some sort of semantic labeling reason? Like, those could be things that help drive your decision. But I think the piece that often teams don't do, or they punt to the side, because of time, because of capacity, because of whatever, is go talk to your community. I don't care if it's one other designer or 600 other designers. Gather some data, right? Because that will help you make an informed decision, so you don't effectively screw over your consumers by accident.
Right. Totally agreed. And I think those HTML basics will also help people to use tools like this, like Infa, and do design audits, right? Because if they don't understand the language of the code, they will spend a lot of time like, oh, I don't know what I'm seeing here, So I think it'd be useful even to use this tool that we are showing today, even.
Great. So we have a couple more components here, right? So I guess out of all those tiles versus cards, we have so many variations of the same tile and card. And I guess the conclusion here is not to police. It's okay if some teams are using their own custom solutions, right? Any final thoughts on the cards? Because like we see here, I like dark cards as well. And maybe they are not dark. Maybe it's just like variation of the card. The same thing, I was able to find this IBM Cloud selectable tile. And as you can see here from the documentation, let me just pull it right here. The selectable tile should have a radial button in the top right corner. And here is in the bottom right corner with icon on the left. So
Right.
where is the red line? Like, are we allowing too much of customization? Or is just a problem of specific team, maybe vendor came in and they just tried to follow design guidelines, but they created their own component because match the code for? Any thoughts on where is the red line should be and like what should we do if we see some kind of this kind of inconsistencies?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's an infinite number of reasons of why this card looks this way, and we're never going to work out what it is. And it will always be the thing that we don't think of, and it will be a very good reason to why they've done it probably. And that's the way I always treat it. Is anytime there's something that's not using the design system, I go in with the best intent that they did it for a good reason, and not for what I understand. So I want to go in and understand why they did that thing. And so we can improve our documentation, our reach out, whatever it may be, so that if we could have done something differently, the next time a person or team is in that situation, they can do it.
They needed to build this card first, and for some reason the variant was not ready on the design system side. So they go with this approach, and then after that they say, okay, we saw those use cases, so now we're going to do like the good and right variant. But it's really common to have like design and code death. Like, okay, that's great, but we're just going to change that like in 6 months because that's not a priority now because we have new features. So I often see that like when sadly the design system cannot follow up some products, you tend to even take so many time to see the final result of your components. And so until then, I think we just need to support the current thing that they have implemented, or in case we don't have anything, we can try to support the process until we have something in our side. So yeah, my 2 cents on that situation, which is frustrating, but I think it's really part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right, Raquel. And I think the only other thing I'd add to that is like just if you're a design systems maintainer, a practitioner on a team working on the side desk, whatever it is, right? I think it's a core principle to not starting small and adding features later, right? Like
Yeah.
what we're seeing in this example of tiles, right? Or cards, whatever you want to call them. There are some common elements across all of these examples, right? And that may be the only thing the design system can ship is the container. Right?
Right.
And if you can do that, it's still incremental value. It's still saving teams time because it allows you to put that first seed in the ground, and then you can always add later or fork a feature into 2 features and do all that later. And I think the thing that teams get stuck on is they go, we need to solve the tile use case for every single team before we deliver,
Right.
or we need to make sure it works perfectly for these 5 teams. And then
Yeah.
they either never deliver the thing, or
Yes.
they take so long because they're trying to make it perfect, and the other team that they were building it for already made their own, right?
Yes.
And then you're like, well,
Yes.
now we have 2, and we actually made more of a challenge. So I think incremental value is important. Starting small is important. Biting off the smallest thing you can try first and making a plan for the next step, right? And that's a reasonable expectation to set with your consumers of like, hey, you all want this, you got 2 different groups want these really, really interactive tiles. Great. We're going to start with this tile. And then we're going to give you that, and then we can add to them later, right? And that is a very healthy mechanism to say, no, pause, we can do this and that tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a couple questions in the chat. So Sam asked the question, thoughts on custom solutions affecting adoption and support costs if team go too off the rails, making upgrade and support costs higher. If our design is the enablement team, providing the design system, yet our customers customize improperly and we get P1 tickets to fix before release, ongoing issue we have to manage, train, guide, and adapt to our customer needs. Any thoughts on that?
I was actually I was typing up a response in chat, so I'll just not type it. I think that there's multiple layers to Sam's question, right? And I think I agree with Donnie's answer, right, in some flavor too, is that help is one thing, responsibility is another, but I think getting at the detail of like what's causing those teams to want that. So back to Raquel's question, like and Daniel earlier, you're talking about going in it with innocence, right? Asking why they're needing to do that fix. Like, what is the fix they're aiming for? Is it truly a problem? Is it something that the team didn't document well enough on the first component and it's not an issue, right? Coming at the problem with let's fix the issue that the bug reported, but let's understand the root of it, right? First, can help you figure out, is it something wrong with the component? Is it something wrong with the documentation? Is it something wrong with the person? Like they don't have the skill to understand? Did the team do something wrong? Like I think we get in the habit from a support perspective of like, fix the problem. But that is the end problem, right? You're cutting off the head of the Hydra. You're not dealing with the fact that it grew in the first place, right? And this is a good example of like, if they're implementing it wrong, you can go to that team and go, hey, talk to us about what's going on, right? Maybe they're doing something wrong. Maybe there's something blocking them. Maybe there's a technology constraint. Like, you don't know. You can't assume that the bug ticket means they're purposely breaking things or they're deciding to override the system. Like, there may be a reason they have to, or maybe they don't understand, right? So that's the untracked work of systems folks. It's all this stuff. It's this customer service, right? And making sure that all the stuff we provide is robust. It's hard.
Right.
It's not easy work.
Right. And try not to fulfill all the use cases, because what I see often is then it appears some specific weird components and you go like, why this component here? Like, why is it in the universal library? Maybe this is just should be like a local component for a local library product instead of being here. They should, however, use our core elements and components to build the custom. But sometimes because we want to fulfill all the needs and all the requests, like, okay, we're going to do that. And then we think like, yeah, why we are doing this? Because it's not suitable, like the universal need. It's just for this one person that is asking me. And we're going to spend a lot of time, and it's just for this person and not for more people. So yeah.
Love it. Really good discussions. Thank you very much for sharing. We can go to the next component family. Maybe it will be better if we will go into the Popover component family, because for content switcher and tabs, we don't have much. we couldn't find much on the IBM website, maybe because it's mostly used within the product itself. So let's get into the Popover. So we grouped this Popover, toggle tip, and tooltip into one section because it's like similar as having as one component family. And within each of those component groups, let's dive deeper into the Popover. Popover is a layer that pops up over all other elements on the page. So here's the link to the documentation, and here's how it visually looks like. The variants that they have is no tip at all, with some caret tip into like the place, the trigger of this action, I guess, and then the tab tip, where it's not just opens on the side, but it also highlights the triggered element. The anatomy here, and here are the components. I typed more than needed, and I'm sure that menu items is not Popover, but I wanted to discuss like how would you call this menu item, element when you click on the product section, for example. You see this like featured section Popover goes on top of the screen, right? So from user experience, it's similar. It's not similar, but like it's like very close to the Popovers family. So that's why we wanted to like highlight and discuss that. There is one Popover that allows people to see the profile with My IBM and login options. There is one more, and similar to the one that on the right, it's more like a sub-menu Popover with more links available to that. And also on the right side, we have this select Popover, where within the search experience, people can select the search scope as IBM catalog or model registry or community registry. And also at the bottom, this is a little bit more, but they also have Popovers for their new AI chat platform, where you're opening it the first time and you see this kind of Popover with the close button on the top right. So like it's completely breaking the pattern that was documented before. And maybe we could discuss, should we document these like new edge cases or maybe things that we're testing? So who would like to go first?
I just want to share to start. I think this Popover, in my experience, seems like an upgrade of the tooltip because you can put more content on it. And usually is to inform something that you are. So, for instance, you're on the tab, it will inform something from the tab. So for me, I see here Popover as a evolution, like an upgrade of the normal tooltip. And actually, when you're trying on the website, he also changes the side. Like if you are moving the mouse to the left, you will appear to the left and stuff like that. So again, I think it's an evolution in that sense. It's interesting because I know that some people call this as a popover with the drop down, and it was interesting that you mentioned. For me, technically, I don't associate with the popover, but I think it's those conversations regarding what people associate the name with, because I see this more as a list item or menu stuff, menu item. I don't consider as a popover, especially because they probably they usually tend to be clickable, and you go to another page. Not sure if your popovers on IBM or have something clickable so you can jump to another part. But yeah, my first 2 cents on the topic. Yeah. Oh, and
Taylor, please.
oh, so sorry. I found very interesting the difference between the toggle tip and the tooltip, and I actually would like to ask for Daniel's opinion. What is the more accessible friendly? Because the toggle tip you need to click to see it, but the tooltip you can only see it if you do the mouse over. So it made me wonder what is more friendly in the user experience in that sense. So yeah, also that thought. Yeah.
Good question. What is more accessible?
Yeah.
As always, there's never a single answer. Like, it
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
depends. The content that you're putting in there is really going to
Yeah.
dictate what's best. If you have a link or a button inside this thing that pops up, then you're really a toggle tip is going to be much better because you want to be able to add a non-modal dialogue. Right? It's a new mode that's coming on the page, but it's not removing everything else behind it. And so that's where you need to be able to have that new focusable kind of area that you can activate those links and those buttons. If it's just a piece of text, then maybe just a toggle tip tooltip may be helpful if we can make sure it works with things like voice control. But the length of text may dictate what's better. So it is all going to depend, again, on what your guidelines of what goes in the component, and it's not just about what it looks like.
And sorry, I caught you briefly, Taylor. I think you were going to something, but then sorry. Yeah.
No. I was just responding to some stuff in chat as we were kind of running through. Yeah, I think the toggle tip versus tool tip versus popover discussion is an interesting one, and I hate to default back to some of the original stuff we were talking about, but it depends on what they're scoped to use for, right? Like they can make a very performant, super usable tooltip, or they can make 3 different components that have very specific use cases. So like in that chat box example, visually, sure, they have some similarities as to how things pop up, but they're very distinctly separate use cases. So there's an argument to be made that like on the UI level, like the front end rendering level, like there is a parity play, right? Maybe we should make things that hover on top look similar so folks know that this is something on top, right? But I think that's a very different goal and a very different charter than we need to make this object usable from a compatibility, accessibility, and functionality perspective. Like visual intent does not always match up with usability, and sometimes it does, right? But there's also variation in how, and remembering that we need to look at these things from both perspectives, even if those perspectives don't match up. And actually, sometimes it's healthy that they don't. Like, I don't know what their bigger brand strategy is on making the popover and the chatbot and all these things blue and making it potentially mimic other visual elements. But I would imagine there's some sort of bigger strategy, happening there. And if there isn't, that would be something like, as a system practitioner, I would go, maybe we need to think about this. Like, does this flyout need to be more visually styled or functionally like the other one? Does that cause risk if we make them too similar that people wouldn't understand that, like, oh, this is a chat bubble, not a tooltip? Like, is there concern around that? I would argue yes, right? So I think there's so many use case specific things that are very conditional to this, but I can understand that, the idea of even calling these things popover, right, or drawer or flyout, but like we've been saying this whole time, like that construct and using common terminologies comes at a cost, right? Of saying may not be the same as popover, and we're assuming that our consumers know the difference, right? Or that they won't see popover in both names and go, oh, it's the same. One just has more functionality, when like very clearly the popover component and the chat popover are not the same, right? So another thing about intentionality and clarity, where maybe calling this chat popover, I don't know, I'm just guessing. Maybe it's causing confusion. I don't know. Something for a team to think about when they're naming their objects, and then when deciding on the scope of them, so that you can make sure it's accessible and matching consistency and all the other stuff we've been talking about today.
Yeah. And there's an argument to that, Taylor, where this chat popover thing doesn't even need to be in the design system. Right? Like our design system
Totally.
is a set of reusable components that lots of teams can use. If there's only one chat on IBM.com, there is no need for it to be in the design system, and the chat team can own it in their area. And it doesn't need to be in there.
Right.
And to even build on that, just because the chat popover object isn't in the design system, it doesn't mean that that object can't use design system tokens, right? Or mimic the features inside the system or the way something looks, right? I think we as design system practitioners need to stop holding on so tightly to it's not adoption, it's not usage unless they use our thing exactly as we do it. If someone is doing something different, it's not always a problem, it's an opportunity, right? Go see what's going on, right? If they're even building it in the same way or to look the same way, maybe there's a good reason they have to build their own. But if it's matching, technically that's a win, right? So like you have to decide what you I think for you asked that earlier, like what is the threshold, right? Like where do you draw that line? And I think that's an important discussion to have, but I think it's also an important thing to keep that milestone moving, right? Because you may in the beginning of your systems program have no line, right? Because people are still learning and you don't want to, it's a hard thing to process in the first place, right? And maybe that line grows over time and maybe you find out you went too far and you got to move the line back. Like it's healthy to iterate on that. It's healthy to have a different perspective. It's healthy to change your stance, right? As things evolve so that the system can truly serve the people that are meant to use it.
Right. And I think on that topic, it might help when you have visual patterns, like more consistent, like what's its usual pattern for spacing, for titles, for colors, for this meaning, and with that purpose and this and that. So maybe people can also invest on patterns and just guidelines for universal needs in case people want to do more custom stuff because something you don't have, or for instance, this chatbot, they probably consider like, okay, for this type of elements and type of components, we usually go like this and we use round corners so it could be more highlighted or something like that.
Yes.
So it would match, so stuff like that.
Raquel, I'm so glad you brought up the pattern thing because I think it's a thing that, I mean, I know I can speak like in my 6-ish years in systems, I have not been able to get to the pattern thing, right? It's always the thing that's like so far away because you got to have some foundational objects to get to, right? So if you think about it that way, like I think to meet what you're saying and to hit all of the things you're talking about today, like teams could support and could think about when there are objects where we can't have a universal single source, single pathway, right? Think about your system and what you deliver for your folks in degrees of flexibility. And what I mean by that is, right, like if we think about a sliding scale of like, do not edit on the left to change whatever you want on the right, right? If you think about that wide scale on the left, right, and the don't change this is like your tokens, right? No one should change those, right? In the middle is your components. There's customization, there's some flexibility, right? And on the rightmost is like things like this, right? Maybe we can just provide the 10 pieces and parts, but there's 700 different arrangements that are valid, right? But let's record some common ones, right? Like the chatbot pattern, right? Uses these colors and these standards and these whatever, but the code exists with the chatbot team, right? But so that the next team trying to make a chatbot, trying to figure out how they're going to chatbot their experience, maybe they don't get a component in the same way they can get the button and the tile and whatever, but they have guidelines on somewhere to start. And those patterns those patterns become things on your roadmap that you can then, once there's enough alignment, enough consistency, enough flexibility of that pattern, you can make components from those patterns, tokens from those patterns, guidelines from those patterns. So it's an interesting, it's a bit of this that I think we often forget, or it's so far down the road that we don't have time, we don't think about it.
Yeah, we're just so focused on having like a solid component that maybe like, okay, let's think like, I don't know, you have a table and a panel. Okay, just make sure that every time that you're using a data grid, put it on the right and the panel on the left. Stuff like that, that at the end of the day, they will impact the visual of the products because that's also what we want, right? So, yeah.
Totally. So here's a challenge for the community, right, of everyone on the call, because I think we're needling on not only time, but that, Raquel, your point right there, right? Like it made me think about, we can challenge everyone on this call. Take the next time you're thinking you're in prioritization, right? Or you're in a road mapping call. Consider not adding a new component to your system. Consider adding a pattern, right? What do you have already out there that folks are using that you could help standardize in a lightweight recorded way? You don't need to keep adding components to your system. You don't need to keep adding tokens to your system. You should
Right.
have a stopping point. And when you stop adding those things in earnest and maybe shift to guidance mode or maintaining those resources or fixing bugs, right? So here's just a silly thing. For every 3 components you put in, consider one pattern on how to use those components together, right?
Right.
Help your consumers learn the thing incrementally. Don't just give them the Lego bricks. They can go
Right.
buy those anywhere. Give them the instructions on how to use the Lego bricks. Show them the model you guys are aiming for. And
Right,
then they will
right.
adopt sooner. They'll become your advocates.
Yeah. And that also can prevent new components to exist because they probably sometimes create new things because they don't know how to combine
Yes.
certain components. So if they would have a guidance on the pattern, maybe that would help a lot. So maybe on the Popovers and the tooltip, maybe that could be something that they already have some pattern inside and we don't know it. We're just seeing the components, but for them it's like, okay, total sense because there's a narrative of using this, this, and that. Yeah. Yeah, you were risking your life there, Fareed. Yeah. but you
Yeah.
got it.
I,
Yeah.
I
You
almost
got it.
how they are going to visualize and explain the AI things, and they have like 3 interesting things here, where they have AI labels, and not just the label, they also have this like some kind of popover explaining the AI models that they are using and how confident they are. Like this is like very interesting pattern to increase transparency with end users on like what kind of models are being used behind the scenes. And also they started documenting AI chat patterns as well. So if you have a time, please take a look. And let me check other things that we didn't cover. We wanted to cover also the content switcher and tabs. I will put all the components that we've tagged here. So it was like very fruitful and very interesting discussion. So thank you very much for all the speakers for joining our session and all the listeners for sharing the links. I'm really enjoying that every time when we talk about anything and we are mentioning any links, people from the community are helping us during the call within the FeedJam, adding links to the things that we refer to. So thank you very much. The FeedJam file will be always available. So that's the main point. If you'll see anything, please, you can add more links, more resources if you want, and you can always come back here and watch the recording to understand what kind of things we discussed about. So thank you very much for all your time. It was a pleasure to have a session with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. It was super fun.
Thanks for having us.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.